Hello, welcome to part 2 of 2 on Bertrand Russell's paper, Knowledge by Acquaintance and Knowledge by Description. Actually, the chapter. He actually has a paper that's in the collection Mysticism and Logic by the same name, and it covers a lot of the same territory, but it's a sort of higher degree of difficulty. The book that this one's from is written as an introduction to philosophy textbook. Okay, so what we've covered so far, I've tried to focus on the question, like, what are sense data? What is acquaintance? What is knowledge by acquaintance? And then I ended up touching on some questions about color perception, where those questions are framed from the sense data perspective. Interestingly, one of our students asked on YouTube comment section, said something like, well, isn't the color really just the wavelength of the light coming off of the object? So I just wanted to say, I think that's a really good thing to bring up. I just wanted to address that briefly before we go on to talk about knowledge by description, which is the focus for today. Okay, here's the stop sign, my object of the hour, and we can all agree that it's red, regardless of whether we see it in inverted spectrum or not. So we have all these different sense data that we might be experiencing. But one thing we can all agree on is that the stop sign is red. The other thing we can all agree on is that the light coming off of it is at a certain frequency. I mean, we can just measure that. And so we can say, yes, the stop sign emits light of this frequency and that is red light. But this doesn't settle the question of what color is the object if we mean that question in the sense of, like, which of these different experiences is, what it really looks like. So we can all say, yes, that is red light, but that doesn't really sort of get us anywhere from the sense data theory puzzle perspective. And this also brings up, some other questions in the philosophy of perception. I mean, this question about what is the color. Is the light red? I mean, the stop sign is red. It emits light of a certain wavelength. That's what makes it red. The fact that it emits light of a certain wavelength of frequency. The light itself doesn't emit any light. I mean, it is the light, but it's sort of like the light carries the it carries the information that the sign is red, and that information is interpreted by our eye. But at the same time, there's a lot of other avenues into this idea that things don't really have color. And the other major way in is to see how the way that our brain works has a strong impact on the way that we interpret the proximal stimulus, the wavelength, the light, the radiation that's hitting our retina. And with different brain configurations, you can affect the way that the color vision operates. You can change the way that the signal is processed. Some creatures have different, retinas, like famously, one of the famous examples in the philosophy canon is pigeons. They have more cones than humans do. And so given the theory of signal processing for color vision, you find out that they see all kinds of different colors than we do, even though they're imbibing the same electromagnetic spectrum. Okay, anyway, that's a sort of side note, but it was an interesting point to bring up, and since we're talking about philosophy of perception and it's an intro class, I figured I might as well elaborate a little bit. Okay, now back to the topic at hand. I want to talk about knowledge by description. What is it? So Russell says that the chief importance of knowledge by description is that it allows us to pass beyond the realm of our private subjective mental experience and sort of cognitively reach out and connect with the external world, know about things in the external environment. So knowledge by acquaintance, that's the kind of knowledge that we have of immediate things that are in our mental sphere. We're acquainted with sense data. We're acquainted with the universals like the color green or whatever. But what we're not acquainted with are the physical objects that we're surrounded by. Okay, actually, so let's pick this one. So here's a physical object. I'm acquainted with the colors. I'm acquainted with the blue and the gray of my sense data. I don't even know if the colors really exist out there in the thing itself, but I'm also acquainted with the shape of the sense data that I'm experiencing. Maybe the, I'm gonna have to wash this hand now. The touch, the feel of the thing, those are all the sense data, and maybe if I knocked on it, I don't want to touch it again. I get some kind of information out of that too. But I'm not acquainted with the physical thing itself. I can think about it though, by thinking about it as the such and such thing. Now, I'm just got to fill in what I mean by that. So when Russell's talking about descriptions, he says they're phrases, they're parts of language, they're expressions of the form a so-and-so or a such and such or the so-and-so. The difference between those two is the difference between what he calls an indefinite description and a definite description. So definite descriptions have the form of the so-and-so. They're definite because they pick out a definitive singular entity, whereas indefinites like a so-and-so are open to being satisfied by a number of different things at the same time. Okay, so an example of an indefinite description would be like a green slide. A definite description would be the green slide at the intersection of Fayette and Broad Street. What the hell is this street called? I'm very bad at knowing where I am in the world. Broadway. I knew Broad Street was wrong. Anyway, so the definite description picks out this slide, this particular one, by basically provides a description that picks out this slide and only this slide. So just to repeat what I was just saying, the phrase a green slide is an indefinite description. It applies to any green slide, a green slide. It doesn't refer to any particular thing. The green slide at the intersection of Fayette and Broadway in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that's a definite description that picks out one and only one object in the universe. So by thinking, I can think about the slide at the intersection of Fayette and Broadway and thereby think of a specific slide. And I'm not acquainted with that slide. I mean, I'm acquainted with sense data that have led me to construct be able to construct my definite description, but I'm not acquainted with the slide. But I can think about it anyway. I can think about it under the description, the green slide at the intersection of Fayette and Broadway. So that's a small toy example of how definite descriptions allow us to think about certain things, certain objects, without being acquainted with them. All right, so the sun is up there somewhere behind the clouds. I've never been directly acquainted with the sun. I've only been acquainted with my sense data of the sun. But nevertheless, I can think about the sun. I can construct a definite description in my mind, the such and such, more specifically, the source of bright golden sense data that I perceive as rising in the sky every day on the planet where I live, Earth, something like that. So if I have a definite description of the thing, that I can think the constituent of the proposition, that's the definite description, I can think about things which I've never been acquainted with directly. And that's the essence of how we are supposed to get out of our own mind and into the world. We have the ability to formulate descriptions. These descriptions apply uniquely to things in the physical environment. And that's our sort of mental media for latching on to stuff in the environment, thinking about it. Okay, so our definite descriptions that I've been using have been using vocabulary that's statable in a kind of common language, but it's actually not the case that we can only think things that we have a common language for. So, like the phrase, "picture's worth 1,000 words." We have the ability to use mental imagery that's more complex than we're able to sort of spell out in our natural language. So check this tree out. This tree is pretty weirdly shaped. I mean, it's sort of, I think it was cut maybe for some purpose to deal with something or other. I mean, it's got a unique shape. And you can have this shape of this tree in your memory. Like, I can think of this tree under a certain description, definite description. In other words, the tree which has such and such a shape, where that shape is just itself a memory that I have in my mind, that I can't necessarily describe it to you or to myself, but nevertheless I could think of the tree in terms of those images. So my definite descriptions can be linked to sort of mental imagery that I can't necessarily express in my natural language. You can use all kinds of other things in your definite descriptions to pick things out, like when I was saying the corner of Fayette and Broadway. But of course, to talk about Broadway, I mean, I'm not acquainted with the street. I have to think about it under some definite description or other in order to get my mind to it. And that description has to be cashed out in terms of ultimately things that I'm acquainted with. So all reference through definite descriptions has to ultimately bottom out in sense data or universals that I'm acquainted with. Those are the things that I can think. Right. So this is actually closely related to what Russell calls the fundamental principle. The fundamental principle says that every proposition which we can think or comprehend or grasp, maybe, every proposition we can think must ultimately be decomposable into its most basic logical constituents must be things we're acquainted with. Otherwise, we can't even think those thoughts. So the ability to think something is closely related to being acquainted with that thing. To think about it is to be acquainted with it. You can't think about it if you're not acquainted with it. You can think about it, sorry, that's an overstatement. You can think about things by definite description that you're not acquainted with. But in order to formulate those definite descriptions, you have to have a vocabulary, the descriptors that go into the description. And those things they have to be things you're either acquainted with, like colors or shapes, or they have to be things that you can think about through description, like the street, Fayette Street or whatever, Broadway. But in order to think about those things by description, you ultimately have to have more vocabulary to pick them out in your own mental, set of descriptors. So ultimately, the idea then is that anything you can think about must ground out or be bottomed out, be able to be logically constructed from or described by things you're acquainted with, your sense data, universals that you've become aware of. Okay. This raises some weird questions. So when you think about Boston, that's a name of a place. You can think about the place, but there must be some description that you think of it in terms of. But what could that description be? It's sort of your whole experience around the thing, all of the kinds of ideas and images that you've built up, or abstract ideas that you've abstracted from your sense experiences dealing with the city, dealing with what people have said about the city, so part of your sense data includes your inner mental experience of hearing me talk, for example, hearing people talk about Boston. So at some point, maybe your whole description of Boston was that city that people refer to when they said Boston. That could have been the whole content of your thought, but it would still pick out by some complex chain, I suppose, the city. Okay, so this touches on this other idea that's pretty crucial that Russell gets us to think about. One of his major theses in the philosophy of language is that names are disguised descriptions. So this sort of, even though Boston seems like it's just, it might seem like it's just a name that which refers to a particular place, But in order for it to be comprehensible to a person, since we're not acquainted with Boston, it's this external object, the true meaning, our ability to think about Boston is dependent on our associating a description with that name. She talks about this as, I have it in the slides I think too, as the idea that proper names are really disguised definite descriptions. They're definite because they pick out a specific individual thing, Boston. Derek Anderson picks out me. But if Russell's right, then the name Derek Anderson has to be associated with a description, or else you couldn't think of me. You couldn't use it to refer to me. Okay. Another connection that's going to come up later is that the fundamental principle, this idea that you can only think about things, that the only way to refer to anything outside of your mind is through connection with the things we're acquainted with in experience. This is an early version of what later gets developed by the logical empiricists. This idea is called an empiricist criterion of meaning. What the empiricist criterion of meaning is it's a decision, it's a way of deciding whether or not a sentence is meaningful. The empiricists liked to say, they like to bully people who have any kind of beliefs that are not grounded in observation and experience. The logical empiricists later would start saying things like, well, your belief that there's a perfect God, for example, it's not just false, but it's totally meaningless. We can't even we have no way of verifying or confirming with scientific empirical evidence that such a thing exists, and therefore it's meaningless to assert that it exists. That's like a later formulation of the principle. But in Russell's version, the principle makes sense in the following way. If you're going to think about something abstract, like a god, maybe not abstract is maybe the wrong word, but something that doesn't have a physical direct manifestation, Russell's question is going to be like, how do you think about it? If you've never had a direct experience of it, you've never seen it, then you can't be acquainted with the thing. But moreover, you have to have had some kind of acquaintance with something or other in your sense experience that could be used to construct a definite description of the thing. If you're a type of person who thinks that God is sort of beyond any sort of measurement, it's just sort of like our ordinary sense concepts, our sense data just don't apply to the kind of being that it is, Russell's going to say, I don't know what you're talking about, and moreover, I think that you can't even coherently believe that you think about such a thing. You're really having nonsensical thoughts. Okay, the last thing I want to mention, which is not really in the reading, but it's worth just saying in order to bring to tie the conversation back again to the kind of skeptical worries that we came up with when studying Descartes. There's a question, how do we know there's an external world? For Descartes, it was very pressing. For Russell, it's still pretty pressing. I mean, he starts with the same kind of assumption that we're only acquainted with our mental imagery. So how do we know there's anything out there that's producing the mental imagery? Russell's answer to this question is, it's just the best explanation of the consistency, the consistent patterns that we find in our inner mental images. So it's kind of a scientific hypothesis. It's like, well, every time I open my eyes, I see stuff like this. And if I close my eyes and open them again, I see the same thing again. What sort of accounts for the consistency and the fact that, when I walk around the tree, I get, a coherent, consistent flow of images that's consistent with there being a thing out there. Russell says we should just infer that the consistency of the flow of the coherent flow of our sense data is best explained by the existence of an external world. So he has an answer to this question, how do we know that it's out there? But his answer doesn't overcome in any striking way the skeptic who says, yeah, but how do you know for sure that our sense data aren't being fed to us by some kind of evil demon? Okay, so for the next lecture, for the next reading for this week, we're covering G.E. Moore, who was Bertrand Russell's friend in graduate school and co-founder founding father of the analytic tradition in Britain. So we're going to look at his argument next, which is aimed at showing that we know that there's an external world. All right.
Happy and I'm smiling.